let's move on here and talk about something that I found very interesting. Over the weekend, I was catching up on reading about the Serbian color revolution against Slobodan Milosevic back in 2000. Just to set this up, he won election in 1990, he began consolidating power, and then he attempted to fraudulently steal an election in 2000. And a lot of things were happening during this period, but the most interesting story begins in 1998. There were some university students who formed this resistance movement called Otpor, and they aimed their movement at removing Milosevic from power. There was a number of U.S.-funded non-governmental organizations, NGOs like National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, among others, and they began providing training in nonviolent resistance tactics to these Otpor activists. And that movement began spreading and establishing resistance cells all throughout Serbia. Most interestingly, they established these cells and they became quite popular in the more rural areas where Milosevic traditionally had most of his support. So while reading a couple of things on this, what struck me most was the movement's decision to focus on eroding the 6 pillars that propped up the Milosevic regime. And if that keyword 6 pillars sounds familiar to you, maybe it's because I was talking about them last week, detailing the U.S.-based indivisible movement strategy, shown on the screen here, to force President Trump and the administration from office. And as you can see, there's 6 pillars here. I'll go through them: business, labor, faith, education, civil service, and military and police. Now, this Otpor movement in Serbia built over a period of 2 years. But once their national resistance movement was actually launched in earnest, they were able to force Milosevic from power in less than a year. This is something I've previously talked about, the advantages of something like a color revolution or popular revolution versus an armed conflict like insurgencies. Historically, insurgencies last on average about 10 years. Once a color revolution gets kicked off in earnest, like once they hit the green light, punch the red button, they're over typically within weeks to months. In this case in Serbia, they used protests, worker strikes, highway blockades, propaganda. They shut down these coal miners went on strike, and they provided coal to a coal-fired power plant, which produced about 50% of the electricity that was used in Serbia. So they're brownouts. And of course, the government responded. They started shutting down power to areas that had lots of resistance, and they were doing all sorts of things to combat this color revolution. But one reason why these popular revolutions are chosen is because they can be extremely difficult to fight. At any rate, so this Otpor movement continues on, and it spreads across the country. They finally are able to force Milosevic into acceding this lost election in the fall of 2000. Now, to be fair, NATO did spend about 78 days in 1999 bombing Serbian military assets, but the political takedown of Milosevic was conducted internally. And I bring this up because something that Robert pointed out last month, and we've been talking about continually, there are a lot of former State Department employees and these NGOs who have had their funding cut, and they're openly admitting, yes, we are now turning our attention to the United States. Things that we used to do abroad will now start happening in the United States. So it should come as no surprise that this country's largest protest organization movement or protest organizing movement is using these types of color revolution strategies. And this slide, Regime's Pillars of Support, that's taken directly from one of their training videos. And this is what they're very publicly acknowledging that this is their strategy. So this is no doubt the aim of the current anti-Trump resistance, or anti-Trump resistance 2.0. My conclusion here, it's pretty obvious that you have all these various anti-Trump groups, and they've developed a strategy or adopted this strategy that begins at protests, which is where we are now, and then moves to resistance, which is where we'll be soon. As a matter of fact, these indivisible groups, they have, I think, like less than a week left to start planning some of their direct action demonstrations, or some of these it's more than protests. It's like civil disobedience kind of stuff. Over the weekend, we saw that in Ohio, I forget what city it was, but they formed an 8-mile-long chain across this city. These activists did, and they're holding hands, and they're doing like a moment of silence or something for these people. And then Robert just covered at the top of the show, you have these 15 activists in New York who are arrested outside an ICE facility for whatever laws they allegedly broke. We're going to start seeing a lot more of this. We are at the point where you have this protest movement that is trying to graduate into the next phase, which is a resistance movement, or like selective or strategic resistance movement. We're going to start seeing a lot more of this stuff. It's going to become a lot more commonplace. And then whether or not we get to a revolution, I don't know. There's maybe 2 or 3 different scenarios that I think would probably trigger that. But the most important thing is, once you have a protest movement that graduates from sustained but toothless protest into direct action or selective resistance, something with a little more bite, if they can sustain that and continue to build it and continue to work towards mass resistance, it's going to make moving to a revolutionary movement much, much easier. And that is by far the most important thing that I see happening in the United States today as it pertains to this anti-Trump resistance. Now, I've never taken Trump seriously when he said that he's going to run for a 3rd presidential term. He's joked about it in the past. I do think he's joking to get a reaction out of opposition, probably because it humors him. I think it also probably goads Trump supporters a little bit too. But I can understand people, if you think that Trump is serious about running for a 3rd term, I can see why you understand that. To be fair, Trump did just say last week that he, quote unquote, probably won't run for a 3rd term. But if Trump somehow does end up working towards a 3rd term, he's just not going to be successful. He's not going to succeed in that. And I'm pretty confident about that, obviously. I think Trump understands this. When Steve Bannon says stuff like this, oh, Trump's going to get in for a 3rd. Guys, there's about a 0% chance that's going to happen. But if he does start working towards, if Trump does work towards a 3rd term, then we will absolutely see this anti-Trump resistance movement push into this 3rd phase of revolution. That is a sure trigger for this 3rd and final phase. But there are 2 other scenarios that I think risk sending this resistance movement into a revolution movement. I remain very concerned about what's happening here in Texas and other states with this mid-decade redistricting plan, or these plans that are being rolled out. If Republicans are able to hang on to a House majority in the 26 midterms, due to states like Texas and Ohio, maybe some other states, handing Democrat seats to Republicans through this redistricting process, then we are going to see this active nonviolent resistance movement target the legitimacy of Congress and the Trump administration. We can look at least a dozen, maybe 20 successful and attempted color revolutions. And sustained large-scale protest is the bedrock in every single case. At the top of the briefing, Robert mentioned that President Trump is now surging federal law enforcement into D.C. because D.C. police have not been able to quell the crime. And again, I don't want to get real conspiratorial about this. However, a case could be made that this is the Trump administration trying to tamp down on crime, not only to make D.C. a nice city, because of course you want your capital to be a nice city, but also maybe to start building the infrastructure or the human infrastructure that if there are riots or if there are sustained large-scale protests in D.C., the administration doesn't have to worry about criminals and the rioters. They just can deal with the rioters. And again, this is maybe a little bit of conspiratorial, but it's just, kind of like second-order effect thinking here. If this does happen, if Republicans do hang on to the House due to redistricting, then I think we probably will come close to something of the scale and intensity of the summer of 2020. It's not going to be BLM riots, but in terms of, I think, turnout and intensity, I think it could rival that, because this is just an area, we're talking about control of the country here, and the other side is not going to just sit there and allow this to happen. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario involves the 2028 presidential election. If this race is close, or if it's contested and a Trump successor does win, there's obviously a higher chance that we see this resistance movement progress into a revolutionary movement. As always, how the candidate wins is the key factor here. If there is an outright popular vote and electoral college victory, that's going to boost the legitimacy for that incoming president-elect, just like it did for President Trump in 2024, and that decreases the likelihood. But if there is a close presidential election that's decided by a single red state, maybe we see some of these split states, what Nebraska's one, there's one like Maine, I don't know. If we do see some of these, if we do see more electoral college points go to this Republican candidate as a result of redistricting, then I think that increases the likelihood. Or if there's an election that's decided by a conservative majority Supreme Court, it is likely to send these groups into a revolutionary movement, or at least an attempted revolutionary movement. I think they're going to give it the old college try, frankly. So I'm going to have much more on this strategy and really breaking down the tactics of what you can expect in your state or at your local level. I'll provide a timeline where I think where we're headed and when it's going to happen, and then, of course, my overall outlook. Coming up on this Thursday's Color Revolution briefing, I'm going to start doing one of these every month because we're starting to see these little pieces of information start to trickle out, and these puzzle pieces that are giving me a much better picture of what the midterms are probably going to look like in terms of protests and resistance. And then, of course, heading into 2028 will be absolutely critical. I'm going to start doing these each month. This Thursday, 2 p.m. Central Time, it's going to be live. It will also be recorded. We'll also get the audio podcast version up. This is going to be a monthly members-only briefing. If you'd like to see what I have to say, start a free 7-day trial. You can check it out. If you don't like it, you can bounce. Most people stay. Head over to forwardobserver.com and sign up. Join our mission, help support our mission, and then most importantly, get access to this intelligence. No one else, I don't want to announce too early, but we're going to start posting some of our stuff to Zero Hedge, and they're allowing us. They reached out, wanted us to be a contributor, which is fantastic because this means we're going to get our message out to a lot more people. This is so important to understand. One of the things that the guy from Zero Hedge said is no one's covering this in the depth and the way that you are, and that's why they wanted us to cross-post some of our stuff over there. So with that, forwardobserver.com, we'd appreciate your support. And okay, so there's a comment here. Attacking the concepts in the pillars is dumb. This is talking about the 6 pillars of the color revolution strategy. It is so easy to reverse the pillars of support. Who does not want what is described in the pillars? Well, listen, this is not about removing the civil service or removing the military law enforcement. It's about removing support from those pillars, removing support for the administration or for any regime among academia or among faith institutions like churches or whatever, or among military and law enforcement. So it's not a case of they're trying to destroy these pillars. They're trying to get individuals and organizations within these pillars to withdraw their support or to not cooperate. One of the things that happened in the latter phase of this Serbian, basically color revolution against Milosevic is they were getting they're getting law enforcement to not stop the protesters or not stop the civil disobedience. In one case in Belgrade, there was a special law enforcement unit that was deployed by Milosevic to essentially quell the unrest, to quell this protest. And most of that law enforcement unit had actually, according to the sources, I don't know if this is actually true, but had already basically defected in place, which is that they didn't leave their jobs, but they deployed and they said, okay, we're going to respond to this, but we're not going to quell the unrest. We're going to let it happen because we're on their side. We're not on the side of Milosevic. If they had refused to be deployed, then Milosevic would have just sent another law enforcement, a special police unit out there that would have enforced it. So we're talking about defections in place or people defecting from the system altogether, like setting down their stuff and like taking their ball and going home and joining the protest faction. So I just want to point that out. They're not trying to destroy the pillars of civil society here. They're trying to cause defections or non-cooperation of the people and groups within these pillars. So that is the strategy. That's also what makes it so effective because, again, unlike a traditional military kinetic style war, you're not shooting at people. You're shooting, quote unquote, shooting. You're attacking the legitimacy, authority, and capacity of a government. That is the strategy. How they do that, those are tactics. But this is the strategy. And when you frame this, when you frame it like this, identifying tactics in the future will become a lot easier. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this members only briefing coming up on Thursday. ForwardObserver.com if you'd like to join and get access to that each month. All right, Jared, what other questions do we have today?
Ben T, with the 6 pillars, is there a critical path where this typically originates and a pattern of progression throughout the pillars?
Yes, in many cases, like we see in Serbia, this is predominantly, well, in many cases, it starts with youth, typically students, like university students. Why? Because that's already what university students do anyway. So, and I will say this: there's a big difference in looking at what happened in Serbia, and it was many students, a lot of political parties involved. And they 18 different political parties eventually united behind a single candidate in the 2000 elections. But yes, this typically starts or often starts as a student-led movement. And I would just contrast that to what we see in the United States today, like at these indivisible and these 50-51 protests. These are old people. I say old people. These are older people. These are boomers predominantly. I've heard from so many people who went and looked at these 50-51 or indivisible protests. They drove down to the city and they checked it out. And it's like all older people. There's not a lot of young people here. So I do think that is significant. That's just a significant data point. This is not to say that it will always be this way. In 2 years, in 3 years, maybe we have a recession. Maybe young people are out of work or they're out of school for one reason or another. And we get a lot of youth involvement. Really, I think the reason why protests is still so appealing to boomers is because they're kind of like even going back to the 60s, like Vietnam era. That's just the protest generation. I think younger generations, I think we're moving to I don't know if you want to call it the post-protest, but I just think younger people are way more inclined towards more active forms of protests like resistance or direct action demonstrations rather than just standing out there, with a sign asking people to honk their horns at you as they drive by. I hope that answers your question.
James from Behind the Paywall asks, if someone was a local 50-51 organizer, what are some of the biggest mistakes they could make?
Allowing violence at your rally it has to be number one. One of the things that happened in Serbia, I think it was a bombing. There was some kind of attack. I'm pretty sure it was a bombing. And the Serbian government, Milosevic, blamed that on the rioters and protesters and used that as a reason, or not rioters and protesters. They blamed that on the protest movement, which may have included some violence, sure. But they used that as a reason to crack down. They eventually Milosevic outlawed the Otpor resistance movement and said, oh, it's a terrorist organization. And they used that to crack down. So I think if you're 50-51 and you're indivisible, you've got to have nonviolence. You have to be the attacker, you have to be the defender. You have to draw an attack. So I think another just strategic mistake by these organizers are not pushing these local protest groups into civil disobedience or direct action demonstrations. They have to be attacked. They've got to be attacked by law enforcement. Law enforcement has to be seen as the attacker. These protest groups have to be seen as the defender. That is where they draw their moral authority from, because they say, look, we're just out here, we're being peaceful and we're being attacked. And this reinforces this whole narrative that they're opposing a dictatorial regime. So I think one major mistake by law enforcement or the Trump administration is to be too heavy-handed and be seen as the aggressor. If the protest groups are not drawing and disproportionate response from law enforcement, if they're not being pepper sprayed, or they're not being arrested for peaceful protest, I think they're making a mistake. This is something they have to do. This is pretty crucial to this whole strategy here.